Señoras y señores,
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome you. This is the fourth conference of the Cathedral, and we are now
conferencias,
commencing
la de hoy
of our presentations, and today we're going to be talking about the Four Seasons and the missing work. Thank you, Professor Falkenberg.
Ladies and gentlemen, beyond matters of attribution regarding works of the great masters, there are not many academic controversies in art history that rise to the level of public discourse or even publicity. One of these rare occasions regards the debate how many paintings Pieter Bruegel the Elder created for his famous series of the seasons, of which you see here the first painting. In 1999, the British writer Michael Frayn published an internationally acclaimed novel titled Headlong, in which he construed a witty and entertaining mystery plot based on a decades-old discussion among art historians whether Breugel's series originally comprised 6 rather than 12 paintings. Frayn took his clue from Tolnay and other art historians that there are currently 5 extant paintings in Vienna, New York, and Prague. This one is in Vienna, this one too. This one is in Prague, this was in New York, and this is again in Vienna. Taking the clue from these art historians, Frayn suspected that originally these 5 paintings had one more companion. And he weaves a story in this book around a painting representing what he titles Merrymakers in a Mountainous Landscape, which the protagonist of the story is convinced is the missing painting, the missing one that originally completed the series. Frustratingly, at least for the art historian, the reader is never treated at a precise description of the painting. We hear about wooded hills, a valley, snow-covered mountains, a sea towards the horizon, and a castle upon a rock, and some clumsy figures, peasants, who are dancing to the tones of a bagpiper, as well as what he writes, little thickest man holding 2 small wild daffodils, expressionally touching with his comically pouted lips to the comically pouted lips of little thick-set women. The colors of the painting suggest a shift in atmospheric qualities he describes that are typical for April and May. Clearly, in this book, we are dealing with a literary pastiche, but not a very imaginative one, I must say. A pastiche of a few well-known paintings by Pieter Bruegel. Snow-covered mountains dominate the background of the Vienna winter landscape, while the clumsily dancing peasants, the bagpiper, and even the comically pouted lips all appear in Bruegel's 1567 peasant dance in Vienna. Here the peasants clumsily dancing, and here the couple with their lips. Only at the end of the novel, the reader is given a glimpse of a small scene representing a figure that is thrown headlong, drowned into a mill pond, apparently an allusion to what is described as the brutal regime of Spain, Philip II, over the Netherlands. But this too echoes motifs in existing paintings, such as the Triumph of Death. The figures that he describes you find in this corner, actually. And before the reader is offered a closer look at this wondrous painting, upon which the authenticity of the painting as the missing link could be established, the painting catches fire and literally burns in the hands of the storyteller. Thus, the novelist's gift of the 6th painting is lost forever and art history has to struggle along again with 5 paintings. Or so it seems. For while the novel takes more from art history than it has to offer art history, there is one element in the story about a found and lost again painting that helps open our eyes to an archival anomaly, the importance of which so far has escaped the attention of the art historical and literary community. As Frayne and others have mentioned, there are 2 archival records from the mid-17th century that play a certain role in the discussion about the original number of paintings, how many paintings belonged to the series. In 1659, so about 100 years after Bruegel painted the series, an inventory was made of the art collection of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, which stated, and I translate, 5 large pieces of one size in which is represented the seasons of the year in oil on panel, original by Bruegel the Elder. 1 year later, an anonymous French letter describing the Archduke's collection says, and I quote again in translation, 6 pieces of Bruegel the Elder, representing the diversity of the 12 months of the year, executed with an admirable artifice of his brush, liveliness of colors, and carefully rendered postures. The difference between these 2 sources, one dating 1659, the other 1 year later, 1660, has not generated much commentary, strangely enough. Only one art historian, Patrick Buchanan, has tried to give an explanation for the difference in number. The 1659 record mentions 5 paintings, the year later mentions 6. According to the art historian, he says, it may be that at the time this letter in 1606 was written, some other painting had been added to the 5. That is, as a replacement of the lost painting. Buchanan's reasoning, the art historian's reasoning, is apparently the following. There are currently 5 paintings that we consider to be part of the series. I showed them to you. The 6th painting was already lost. It appears in 1659, probably even earlier. 1 year later, a 6th painting appeared to have been added to compensate for the loss. But then this one got lost again, or lost too, leaving us again with 5 paintings. There is, of course, something strange in this reasoning. It seems strange that the 6th painting was added to the 5 extant paintings precisely in the period when the 2 records were made, in or around 1659 or 1660, and then immediately got lost again. Well, this is perhaps not impossible. To me, it sounds unlikely. That is to say, one has to accept that these 2 sources simply contradict each other. And we, I think, make a mistake if we automatically assume, since we have 5 paintings, that the person drawing the inventory in 1659 was correct, and that the one mentioning 6 paintings a year later made a mistake. So if we look at this archival record, the figures swing back and forth between 5 and 6. In 1595, in the inventory of Archduke Ernst, it's mentioned 6 paintings. In half a century later, we hear 5. 1 year later, 6, and now 5. 5, 6, 5, 6. Is there a way to account for this strange alternating pedigree? And I suggest that we now do a little detective work, that we follow Inspector Wallander or Sherlock Holmes, and then we're going to look for the corpse. So one way to address this swing in numbers, which no one really has addressed so far, One way to address it is to assume that the person who in 66 mentioned a series of 6 paintings saw something that the person a year earlier failed to recognize, namely that the series did not necessarily consist of 6 similar paintings, but of 5 similar ones and 1 deviating from the rest, deviating enough for some people to treat it as a separate work. In other words, hypothesis, could it be that the series were created according to the principle 5 plus 1 or 1 plus 5, and that the 6th painting all the time was there and possibly still exists? If we accept this theoretical possibility, the question is, how would this painting have looked like? How would we be able to recognize it so that it could be seen as both part of the series and different from it? And then, of course, the question is about the corpse. Is there among the extant paintings by Pieter Bruegel one that fits this 6th painting? In order to address this question, I would like to start by giving a resume of an interpretation of Breugel's series of the seasons that I offered a couple of years ago, in order to form ourselves an idea of how such an enigmatic painting, the lost one, would need to be or would have needed to look like in order to fit this paradox. As I argued, based in part on earlier literature, each of the 5 extant paintings represents 2 months, or can be associated with 2 consecutive months, generally following the traditional iconography of the 12 months of the year that we find very often illustrated in late medieval books of hours. So the return of the herd can be associated with September and October, the hunters in the snow with November and December, the dark day with January and February, the hay harvest with May and June, and the wheat harvest with July and August. That is to say, the missing painting must have been associated with the months March and April. The reason for this particular order, which most scholars adhere to, I suggested is brought out by small vignettes and signs with a religious theme that bring to mind particular events from the life of Christ and the history of salvation. As a preamble to my thesis, I argued that Pieter Bruegel's series of the seasons roots more in the pictorial language of early 16th century Flemish world landscape tradition than generally has been recognized. This tradition itself is often misunderstood as representing an emerging genre of aesthetically autonomous landscape paintings that leave the religious imagery from which they descend behind. The religious scenery, often distributed over a series of tiny storytelling figures, are spread throughout the landscape, should not be considered, in my view, a meaningless residue of religious figures that formerly dominated the scenery. So this is the new type. This is landscape painting with here in the Prado Museum showing you Saint Jerome in the desert. And the older type, in a way, is represented by this painting by Hieronymus Bosch, where you see Jerome taking far more, his figure takes center stage. But these small figures, and I showed a few landscapes to you, one of my other presentations here. These small vignettes, these small religious scenes, should be taken as a pictorial device that creates a particular reception aesthetic effect in its own right. What landscape paintings such as this one by Harry Mettebles, and this one with the landscape of the man going to Emmaus. Here you see the man going to Emmaus. Emmaus is over here, and the painting is about this size in reality. What these paintings have in common is that the religious scene representing the crux of the story, that is, the revelation of Jesus' divine nature, is placed far in the background of the landscape, There is Emmaus, where Jesus will reveal his real identity to the man with whom he has traveled. So you see these revelatory tiny scenes in the background or in the margins of the composition. Even in this blown up detail, and this is about 2 centimeters wide in reality, you will find it hard to recognize that there are the men sitting at table where Jesus will reveal his identity. So by making the thematic anchor figure so small that the viewer's perception hovers between truly seeing the figure and imagining seeing the figure, this device engages the viewer in the very change from corporeal sight to spiritual sight that is at the core of the biblical story itself. That is to say, the pictorial strategy of miniaturizing the religious narrative is aimed at enabling the viewer to share in the revelatory experience of changing the way one sees the world, and to see Christ's presence in the world with the eye of spiritual insight. Now, the difficulty of detecting the tiny religious figure in the disorienting abundance of details is both an obstacle and at the same time the very road to the rewarding aha experience. One of the visually most intricate and rich examples of this pictorial strategy is offered by Harry Mettebless's Landscape with the Road to Calvary in Princeton. A scrutinizing eye, and the painting in reality is about this size, so relatively big compared to the others, but a scrutinizing eye of the viewer can observe at least 8 tiny scenes in the background, in addition to the scene in the foreground of Christ carrying the cross. These tiny scenes of the Passion, which are distributed over the vast world landscape in the background. This detail is here and is about this size too, 1 centimeter. The scenes here, the Ecce Homo, Ecce Homo scene, and the entry into Jerusalem, and the denial of Peter, are shown on a millimeter size dimension, which even in reality are extremely hard to see. So this layout of the biblical narrative leads the viewer to travel with your eyes through the landscape and to endure through the eye-straining effort to detect all the scenes of the Passion in an aesthetic fashion, the hardship of the road to Calvary yourself. And thus, in a way, you will enact an imitatio Christi. You will follow Christ with the eyes of inner compassion, the eyes of your heart. I've argued that Pieter Bruegel continued this tradition and brought it to an entirely new level of sophistication in the series of the Seasons. Each of the 5 accent paintings cast a pictorial narrative, especially in the activities of the human figures that, on the surface of things, represent the so-called labors of the months, but on close inspection reveals something about Christ's presence in the world to which mankind is corporeally and spiritually blind. I will explain this for each of the 5 paintings in a brief fashion. And it is important to realize that my analysis, due to lack of time of course, can only regard the human narrative in these works and not the landscape as such. Breugel's stunningly naturalistic representation of the world is of course the main subject of the painting, but this should not close our eyes to this underlying religious narrative. We can be relatively sure in the assumption that Bruegel received a commission to paint this series in or shortly before 1565 from the wealthy merchant, financial administrator and art lover Nicolaas Jongelink, who wanted the series to decorate his newly built villa just outside Antwerp. There is an archival record suggesting that shortly after the paintings were made, so shortly after 1565, Mr. Jongelink was forced to hand them over already to the city of Antwerp as a liability against certain debts that he had. So the paintings hung only very, very short period of time in the villa. And were then 30 years later presented to the Archduke of Austria as a gift in 1595. So we are pretty sure about the pedigree of these paintings. Now, Jongelink's villa has been destroyed. And we do not know where and how the paintings were hung. So in the following, I present these paintings in accordance with the annual cycle of the seasons, beginning here with the Hunters in the Snow, without knowing how exactly they were placed in the villa. So here, set against the backdrop of a vast snow-covered mountain landscape that is entirely in the grip of a freezing winter cold, we see a group of huntsmen descending from a height in the foreground towards a valley in the distance. Since there is no road to recognize, they follow, because of the snow, they follow a line of trees as markers for their path. They are followed by a pack of dogs who, like the hunters, look jaded. A dead fox, who itself is a hunter, of course, hangs over the shoulder of one of the hunters. It emblematically signifies the lack of life, of energy of the entire group. They look very tired. The hunters nor their dogs notice the traces in the snow of a hare that has crossed their path, which you can see here. They don't pay attention to what could have been their catch. Their eyes are fixed on the snow-covered ground as they pass by an inn carrying a signboard. Here's the inn, here's the signboard. Carrying a signboard with an image of the hunter's patron saint, Saint Hubertus. They do not notice the saying nor the sign. The signboard swings on one hinge, as you see, in the winter cold, which bespeaks of negligence. No one seems to care about its precarious state. Lack of care or carelessness is also visible in the small genre scene below the sign, in front of the entrance of the inn. In accordance with the tradition of the so-called labors of the months, a small group of people are busy singeing, getting rid of, by way of burning, the hairs of a slaughtered pig, an activity usually associated with the activities of the months November and December. As you see here, two examples from late medieval Book of Hours, calendars in Book of Hours. So Bruegel follows that tradition. But the fire that these people use in order to burn off the hairs is caught by the wind and is blown dangerously close to the open window in the facade of the inn. A man carrying a table, all traditional props of the labor's iconography, has turned his head around and does not seem to be aware of the danger that he is in, namely, he's about to trip over the bucket of water, which would be a serious loss, of course, in case the house would catch on fire. Now, in case you would think that this reading puts too much weight on a trivial genre scene, that I read too much into it, one should notice another genre scene, similar genre scene, depicted far, far in the background of the desolated White Plains. It shows indeed a house on fire, or to be more precise, people who are trying to extinguish a chimney fire, which typically occurs as a consequence of negligence, of disregarding the need to regularly sweep the chimney. That is, of not performing the necessary labor of the month. The entire foreground scene, show you, go back to this slide. The entire foreground scene, in other words, signals a lack of care, precisely in the figures performing the labors associated with November and December. Now, when we take a more precise look at the loosely hinged sign, we may be struck by the text. It's actually readable. The text below the crude representation of Saint Hubertus. This text over here, which shows the sign shows the saint having a vision of a crucifix in the antlers of a stag. You can barely see that representation. Now, the text below that representation reads, "Dit is in den hert," which is Dutch for "this is in the deer," but could also be translated as "this is in the heart." Hert means deer, but also heart. So is this a pun on the fact that the hunters don't pay any attention to their patron saint and thus don't have them in their hearts? But even more importantly, since the hunters fail to notice their patron saint, they also fail to see the object of Saint Hubertus' vision, the tiny crucifix that is the figure of Christ appearing in the deer's antlers. And this is perhaps an even more portentous act of overlooking, in view of the fact that the inn, which is marked on the outside by the sign of Jesus' manifestation in the freezing December month, brings to mind the story of the birth of Christ, of course, the birth of Jesus, when Mary, and I quote scripture, wrapped the child in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Jesus swings outside the inn. The painting, therefore, by subtly evoking all this with tiny, seemingly meaningless genre motifs, implicitly raises the question whether the viewer of Bruegel's painting is any different from the laborers of the months and discards the sign of Christ's presence in the world too, and thus fails to have him or her, or him, that is Jesus, in your heart. Like in earlier word landscape paintings, the extremely small dimensions of this sign enables the viewer to personally go through the experience of perceiving somehow with your corporeal eye or in your imagination something that hovers between visibility and invisibility, between seeing and seeing, a perception that is fragile, like the sign itself, that hangs on a single hinge exposed to the icy wind gusts. I cannot discuss the other 4 paintings of this series at the same level of detail as I've done with this particular painting. And of course, again, only a few details I mentioned here. With regard to the other paintings, I will only briefly address the representations of the labors of the months in each painting, because it is with a manipulation of the traditional iconography that Bruegel stages the paradoxical complex of seeing the inconspicuous signs of Jesus' salutary presence in the world, or not. The dark day shows the activities traditionally associated with January and February, that is, the pruning of trees and executing the necessary repairs on houses following the winter storms, which you see are still raging in the background. And it's interesting to compare the activities that you see here in the foreground and this hugely inundation in the background landscape. If you compare it with the older calendar tradition, here you see the sign of Aquarius that already in some other calendars turned into a genre scene where the pouring water from a jug has now filled the whole sea. And it is in a way this kind of narrative elaboration that Bruegel continues in his huge landscape series. And now the entire world, the vast landscape is inundated. Now some of the villagers on the right are not really laboring, but are going around engaged in a folkloristic ritual which was associated with the Feast of Epiphany, that is in January the 6th. Judging by the crown the child is wearing. The hardly visible star on the other side of the inn that is attached to the end on the opposite side of the composition also has an inscription which reads, "This is in the star." And of course, these words, in view of Epiphany, these words evoke the liturgical aspect of the Feast of Epiphany, namely the commemoration of the adoration of the Magi, the adoration of the just born Christ child by the Magi. Now, this tavern over here is not a godly place. On the contrary, a man literally, I'm afraid, shits on this place, while another is urinating against the wall, and a third is playing a violin. A few steps away, a child and a woman are dragging a man towards the entrance of the inn. All this seems to signal how much the fallen world, like the fallen star, if you will, is discarding heavenly signs of salvation. However, another small but striking detail potentially harboring a sign of God's restorative plan for the world may be seen in this tiny detail. That is a single white bird flying high above in the sky. Its white color strongly contrasts with the dark storm clouds, and the combination with the deluge-like inundation of vast parts of the landscape brings to mind the Old Testament story of Noah and the dove that returned to the ark, signaling the end of the flood. This bird signals perhaps not only that winter is coming to an end, but also announces the arrival of another redemptive event. According to St. Augustine, the church father who had an enormous impact on late medieval religious thinking, according to St. Augustine, Noah was the first person who planted actually a vineyard after the flood. And the Bible tells us how he got drunk from the wine produced by the vineyard. And that fact, according to Augustine and all these theological thinkers, prefigured the thought of and prefigured the passion of Christ, who often was represented as trotting the wine press. As you see in both examples here, Christ under the cross is trading the wine, and here in the bottom you see the same image related to Christ's crucifixion. So the white bird may be signaling the end of the flood-like inundation in the background. And if you think of the series as continuing, you could imagine that it could herald the theme of the next painting, which is the missing one. And thus, the implication of this tiny motif could be that the next painting, which would be covering the months of April and May, would somehow need to visualize the Passion. But we don't have the corpse, we don't have the sixth painting, and this is of course only speculation. So skipping that missing painting, of course, I have to address, the next one in the series is the so-called hay harvest, which relate to the months of May and June. I will focus on a group of figures in the foreground that one encounters more often actually in landscape paintings of the period. This regards the group of peasants who, seen from behind, are heading for the market laden with large baskets that are filled to the top with the rich produce of the land, characteristic of early summer: beans, peas, strawberries, turnips, etc. We have actually encountered the same figures in paintings representing the road to Calvary by Harry Bless, Jan van Amstel, and Pieter Bruegel. I showed some of them. Here these details from peasants going into the opposite direction of Christ. Christ is heading this way to Golgotha. The peasants are going this way to the market. In the hay harvest by Bruegel, they pass also, these peasants, these market vendors, pass this little group of women, female workers who are heading for the fields, the hay fields, to help bringing in the hay. I will not comment on this particular female worker and on the possible erotic connotation of the youngest of them, the one closest to us, who seems to be actually to leave the little group, to turn a little bit, not to the hay fields, but is heading for the peasant in the corner who is preparing his scythe, pun intended, on the other side of the composition. However, the real antipodes of the market vendors are not these women, but a small roach shrine containing a tiny sculpture of a Madonna and Child, which the peasants are just passing. First pointed out to you here, really tiny detail. Here you see it a little bit more clear, but from an angle you can only half kind of suspect that the Madonna and Child are there. As you see, a small jug is placed beneath the shrine, which peasants used to fill with flowers or other gifts to the Virgin as token of gratitude for a rich harvest. As you can see from another painting by Bruegel, this detail on the left. And also Madonna and Child and a jug, and there you find as a gift flowers, some sign of gratitude for the harvest. In the hay harvest on the right, however, the jug remains empty as the vendors pass by because their heads are averted, loaded with foods and other thought. This entire constellation bespeaks of the same disregard of the labors of the months for signs of divine presence that we have seen in the other paintings of the series. Now, the angle under which Bruegel has placed the shrine makes it almost impossible for you, the viewer of the painting, to detect the Christ child. This is, of course, no coincidence. This challenges us, viewers, to perform precisely there where the peasants fail. The wheat harvest offers a representation of the labors of July and August, when late summer crops, wheat, apples, and so forth, are being harvested. At first glance, the activities of the laborers are entirely in accordance with traditional calendar illustrations. There's nothing in the way they act. There's nothing in the way the peasants in Bruegel's painting act that could be seen as being adverse to or in disregard of the manifestation of Christ's salvific presence in our day-to-day world. The rich wheat crops, which could raise thoughts of Christ as the Eucharistic bread, as they do in paintings such as Hugo van der Goes' one, where you see this clear parallel between the Christ child and this shape of wheat, which of course is an allusion to the Eucharist. But in Bruegel, we don't see that necessarily in this huge field of wheat. In Bruegel's painting, we do not see these eye-opener effect of small details that the other paintings have, because these crops just visually dominate the painting. Even the resting peasants who enjoy a meal under the shadow of a large tree in the foreground are stock and trade motifs and do not prompt a pejorative reading. The games that people play in the far distance, too, are part of the activities with which calendar illustrations of the period present the major feasts of the liturgical year. I mention this liturgical connection because calendar illustrations, in essence, serve the purpose of helping the reader to keep track of the feasts of the saints that were celebrated in church throughout the year. And if we approach Bruegel's painting from this angle, of this kind of liturgically informed angle, we may be struck by one particular detail that indeed diverges from traditional calendar representations. And that may help the viewer bring to mind the most important feast of this time of the year, namely the feast commemorating the death and Assumption of the Virgin on August the 15th. And what is the detail that I've set my eye on? This tree. And the strange way that it branches out to the very, 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 very top, where you see small pears hanging on the tree. The pear was a well-known symbol of Mary, but also a Christological symbol in Bruegel's day. It was understood to refer to the biblical saying of Christ, of Jesus, being the fruit of Mary's womb. As you see here, for example, there are many other examples in the painting of Giovanni Bellini, where Christ holds the pear. He is the fruit of Mary's womb. Now, the pear tree in Bruegel's painting spreads its leaves across the upper border of the painting, and it is from here, from that higher perspective, so to speak, from there that the ripe pears have fallen down and have been collected by the peasants. You see them, if you look carefully, you see them lying ready for consumption on a white cloth, which the peasants have gathered for their meal. Is it then that Bruegel's painting suggests that these pears have fallen from heaven? That is to say, that there is a relationship between the representations of the Virgin, which you somehow can see here in this calendar depiction, the same theme of peasants collecting the crops, and here the representation of Virgo, which also stands for Mary, is literally looking down on the earth. Is it that Bruegel wants to bring to mind to us viewers that kind of calendar illustration where Mary is looking down from heaven after the Assumption to heaven? And that these fruits have fallen from heaven. What is the fruit that has fallen from heaven? That is Jesus, of course. Is it from this perspective that the harvesting of the wheat, the sheaves of wheat, and the actual meal with bread, porridge, and pears altogether celebrate not only the fruitfulness of the earth, but also the fruit of the Virgin's womb? Judging by the facial expressions of the peasants, they do not seem to be aware of this higher bird's eye perspective. But are we? The last painting representing the return of the herd evokes the fall, that is September and October, when the herds are being driven back from the fields to their stables in preparation for the coming winter. Here too, in the particular way the activities associated with these months have been portrayed, lies a certain Christological perspective embedded, for whoever wants to see it, of course. This regards the rainbow in the background, which Bruegel has drawn against some black storm clouds with which the approaching winter is announced. Of course, you have to imagine that the series goes around and around in one room in the villa. You move from one painting to the other, and at the end of the year, you start over again. And there clearly is an implication in this series that you look from left to right. So towards the right is always the next month. The rainbow in the background, of course, approaches in a way the approaching winter, announces the approaching winter. But, of course, it is also the sign given by God to Noah as a promise that he will not allow the earth to be subjected to another devastating deluge. It can hardly be coincidence that this is close, the rainbow is very close, high up to the top of a barren mountain, where laborers, and that is a strange detail, high up in the mountains here, not only here, but over there, laborers of the months are showing to be engaged in the harvesting of grapes. A very unlikely place to grow grapes. Noah's story of the ark, which stranded on a high mountain when the waters started to recede, was commonly held as a prefiguration of Christ. I mentioned it before, the winepress. Christ, who was crucified, of course, on Mount Golgotha for the salvation of mankind. The harvesting of grapes on a mountain that literally recalls the shape of Mount Golgotha in several early Netherlands landscape paintings, thus is a proper preamble on the right side of the painting to the next one, which again is the return of the herdsman. So where where's the sixth painting? Well, we are now in a position, I think, to propose an hypothesis about the sixth painting that may have completed this series, even if it may have diverged from the other paintings in some, perhaps major respects. If my interpretation is correct of this series, that the inconspicuous manifestation of Christ's salvific presence in the world is the underlying and unifying theme of the series, we may infer that there is one particular topic that would make the missing painting, namely representative for the months April and May, the perfect fit for the series. And that is the Passion of Christ. That would be the theme that is fitting for those months. And it would need to be represented in an inconspicuous fashion. So, what about this painting representing the Passion, the Road to Calvary? We talked about this extensively last time, showing the landscape with Christ carrying the cross in Vienna. That is, the painting hangs just a few meters, literally a few meters away from 3 of the other paintings of the series in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and may have been in the close vicinity to these paintings ever since the 16th century. It measures 124 by 170 centimeters and is thus only a few centimeters larger than the other paintings. This difference is small enough to create a general impression of cohesiveness of format with the other works, but the painting would, of course, also stand out individually in other respects. While formally standing in the tradition of the world landscape like the others, it does not show the season-specific characteristics of April-May, nor does it show the respective labors of the month. Well, it does show the labor of the year, if you will, but this may be a little pushing it too much, my hypothesis. The year of its creation is 1564, that is 1 year before the others, which are dated 1565, which of course does not speak in favor of one premeditated overall design of the 6 paintings. The reason for still proposing this hypothesis is the subject matter of the Road to Calvary, and more importantly, the way Bruegel has treated those subjects, which we have discussed in detail at this other occasion. All paintings are joined in bringing the presence of Christ neglected, discarded, sabotaged to the attention of the viewer in a particular paradoxical way, which appeals to the eye, to your eye of the heart, and produces precisely the emotional identification with the religious protagonist, and produces a reflection of Jesus' presence in the world, which is lacking among the laborers of the month, who are supposed to perform the activities that are fitting and appropriate to the respective season. Perhaps Nicolaas Jongling's commission started with a single painting, the landscape with the carrying of the cross, this painting, after the completion of which it was decided to turn it into the primus inter pares, the first among all of them, as the first among a series of paintings that would decorate an entire room of the villa. The centerpiece, which may have stood out visually as a chimney piece, for example, would have given the viewer visual, mental, and emotional guidance for the exploration of the underlying theme uniting the other paintings. Without this guidance, it would have been hard to figure out what this underlying theme was, the unrecognized presence of Christ's salvific presence in the world. And once the connection between this painting and the others got lost, that is, not recognized anymore, the awareness of this common underlying theme disappeared from the collective consciousness and appreciation of Pieter Bruegel's art. I hope, though, that today we have rediscovered some of the subtleties of the pictorial inventiveness and thought that holds these unique series of the seasons together. Thank you.